Grateful to be with you here this morning. We're tackling giants and really talking about how do we face these giants, and even more than that, how do we lean into God's power to take down these giants that can exist in our lives. But how many of you have ever had a moment that right after you did it, you were filled with regret? Have you ever had one of those moments? I probably have way more of those than I'm willing to admit or for sure willing to share with you. But there's one of those moments for me when I was in college. I went to a real small Bible college in Missouri, and the college that I attended, they hosted this conference for junior high students every single year. And I love young people. I love the opportunity to invest my life into young people. And so I volunteered just to help out at this conference, and I was asked to teach a workshop. Now, at the time, it was the first workshop that I'd ever taught before, and so I was really excited about the opportunity. So I remember showing up to the room probably 30 minutes early before it was to begin and set the room just the way I wanted. I wanted to make sure I was there when the students began to arrive. And so as they began to trickle in, I was having some fun with them and high-fiving and joking with them and finding out a little bit more about who they were, where they're from, and all that kind of stuff. Well, it came time to actually start the workshop. And so I went to the front of the room, I started the presentation when these 5 kids walk in late, 4 girls and a guy. And I thought, what a great opportunity to have some fun with them, walking in a little bit late. But I let the 4 girls have the pass and to go by me, but I stopped the guy in front of the whole room. And I said, hey bro, what's your secret hanging out with 4 gorgeous women? This kid just looked at me like I was a total idiot. But that happens to me quite often, so that doesn't really stop me. And so I said, no, so like you've been working out, you've been eating your Wheaties because you got something going on. This kid just looked at me like I was a moron. And I don't know when to stop. And so I thought I would just press it one more step forward, and said, well, you've got to understand I've really been struggling with my dating life, and I thought that maybe a guy like you could really help me out. And finally he looks back at me and says, I'm a girl. I know. And the more you think about it, the worse it gets, I promise. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It's brutal. And so this poor little girl goes and sits down in the workshop that I now have to teach, looking her in the eyes. I mean, it was brutal. You remember those Southwest Airlines commercial that the tagline is, want to get away? Like, I wanted to get away. Like, it was a brutal moment that I had unintentionally, but nevertheless, there was something that I said that really wounded somebody else. And we've all probably been there. Hopefully you haven't done anything that stupid, so sorry. But we've all been there, right? That we've said something, we've done something, whether it's intentional or unintentional, that harmed the life of somebody else. But we've also all been on the other side of it too, where somebody else has done something or somebody else has said something that has wounded us in a very deep way. And it's almost a universal experience. We all have the experience, but maybe we experience it to varying degrees. The challenge is when we find ourselves in a situation where somebody has said something or done something that's caused great pain in our life, there's this progression that oftentimes plays out. That our immediate response is that of obviously experiencing pain, and so that tends to lead to anger. If that anger is allowed to continue to fester, it leads to bitterness, and if bitterness really gets a root and begins to grow, we can become quite resentful. And typically the more painful and the deeper the wound, the greater the giant becomes. Now, what's true about me in my life is I only stand 5'8", so pretty much everything in life to me is a giant. But when it comes to this issue of resentment, I've had my fair share of resentment giants throughout my life. And typically it's that progression. It's when anger goes unaddressed, it becomes bitterness. And when bitterness becomes unaddressed, it becomes resentment. And resentment can become a larger and larger and larger giant if we allow it to continue to grow in our lives. So the question becomes, how do we face this giant? And maybe even more important, how do we lean into God's grace and power to ultimately slay the giant so that we can become the person that God has created us to be? Today we're going to look at really what it looks like to face the giant of resentment. We're going to look at a powerful passage that Jesus gave to us. It's recorded for us in the book of Matthew chapter 5. So if you got a Bible, you can go to Matthew chapter 5. It's recorded for us in Jesus' most famous sermon, the sermon that we now call the Sermon on the Mount. Chapters 5, 6, and 7 are the sermon that Jesus delivered on a mountain. So hence the name Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus in this sermon, he doesn't pull many punches. He goes right after some things and delivers some very, very difficult teaching. But I would also argue If we're willing to embrace his difficult teaching, they can be some of the most life-giving, life-changing teachings that we have from Jesus. And so here it is, Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start at verse 38. The words are going to show up on the screen as well. If you can help me out by yelling out the highlighted word for me. It helps me make sure you're awake, and frankly, it keeps me awake too. So help me out with that highlighted word. Here's what Jesus says. He says, "You've heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person." Now, what's interesting is Jesus goes into our most often response when somebody wounds us. Like when somebody says something to us, what's our immediate reaction? We want to say something back. Like if somebody does something to us, what's our immediate reaction? We want to do something back. It's kind of this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality. It's our gut reaction. It's our gut instinct. It's almost like that's our hardwiring. It's what we want to do. And Jesus says, I don't want you to operate like that. That I understand you're going to live in a world that you get things done to you, whether it's intentional or unintentional, the things that are wounded to, you're going to experience that. But I don't want you to respond in that way. I don't want you to respond in a way that's natural to you. He says, instead, I want you to be a person that does not resist an evil person. What in the world does that mean? And sometimes we can read those words, and it's almost like we read them to think that Jesus is advocating a passive response. That we don't have revenge, so we just kind of take a passive approach, and we let the offender continue to offend us over and over again. That is not what Jesus is saying. The word resist is probably better translated as stand against. It's a military term. You remember in history course, there was Custer's last stand, right? It's okay to take a stand and to stand against the offense. And so Jesus says there's really two typical ways that people respond. Way one is people will take revenge. Or way two, people will take a passive approach and do nothing. And what Jesus will advocate for us is a third way, a third option that is not revenge, but nor is it passive where somebody continues to take advantage of us. It's actually a third way. And he gives three examples to illustrate his third way. Here's his first example. He says this, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, sorry, I'm going to let you try that highlighted word for me again. Okay, it says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, man, you guys are good. Turn to them the other as well. And so what's interesting about this example is many times we read this, we go, oh, Jesus is advocating a passive approach. Somebody strikes you on one side, let them strike you again. That's not what he's advocating. And the reason you can understand this is if you understand a little bit more of the historical context. In the ancient world, this is better translated as a slap, and it's kind of a backhanded slap. It's what you would do if you were somebody in authority trying to demean somebody under you. You're trying to shame them. It's not intended to hurt them, it's intended to shame them. Now, what's interesting in the ancient world, if you were to do such a thing, you would always do it with your right hand because it was considered your clean hand. You would never do so with your left hand. It was considered your unclean hand. I'll spare you why that was your unclean hand, but I'll let you fill in the details, okay? And so if you were doing such a thing, it was probably even culturally acceptable to shame somebody by slapping them with your right, but it would be shameful for the perpetrator to ever slap somebody with their left. They would never do it. And so what Jesus is saying is, if somebody strikes you, is trying to shame you in this way, turn to them their other cheek, because the reality is they'll never do it because they will never bring the shame on themselves. Make sense? And so Jesus is saying, I don't want you to take option one, which is revenge. Don't slap them back. But nor do I want you to be passive and just allow people to take advantage of you. There's a third way that allows you to stand against. Here's the second example. He says this. He says, if somebody wants to sue you to take your tunic, let them have your cloak as well. Now, the tunic was the undergarment, your underwear. The cloak was the outer garment. And Jesus is saying, if somebody is so low that they're suing you for your underwear, go ahead and give them your outerwear. The challenge is that would leave you standing naked, right? Now, in the ancient world, it was not necessarily shameful to be naked in the situation. It was shameful to look on somebody who was naked. And so again, it's not taking revenge, but nor is it being passive. Instead, it's choosing to stand against. Here's the third example. He said, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. And this someone in particular is referring to a Roman soldier because they would have been everywhere. And people would have known what Jesus was talking about because there was a Roman law that said that a Roman soldier could command you to carry their 80-pound pack at any moment. You could have been, mowing your grass, going to Mariano's, and if a Roman soldier told you to carry their pack, you got to carry their pack. But they were not required, or they were not allowed to ask you to carry the pack beyond 1 mile. If you were to carry it beyond 1 mile, their butt's on the line with their commander. They weren't allowed to do that. So Jesus is saying, hey, if somebody asks you to do this soldier asks you to do it. And then when the mile's done, just keep walking. Why? Because that soldier will be chasing after you, begging you to drop the pack. Do you feel the example? It's not revenge, but nor is it passive. Jesus is advocating for an active way to take a positive stand in the face of adversity when people are offending us. Approach number 1 is active, but it's negative. Approach number 2 is passive. I would also argue it's negative. But Jesus is advocating for an approach that is active, but it's positive. And he takes it one step further in the very next verse. Here's what he says. He says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, that's a doozy, isn't it? Love your enemies. That sounds good. Maybe it's something we even knew that Jesus said, but surely that doesn't mean that applies to the person who's hurt me. Surely that doesn't, if Jesus would truly know my story, maybe my story's an exception. Because you may say to me, well, Sean, I grew up in a really tough home. One of my parents abandoned my family when we were really, really young. It completely disrupted. I didn't have a normal childhood like other kids had. I grew up in an abusive situation. I was incredibly neglected. I didn't have the same opportunities that other kids had. And that parent has caused so much pain in my journey, I don't know how to love them. Maybe somebody else might say, surely that doesn't apply to my ex-spouse. They were unfaithful. They walked out on our family. To say the word destruction would not be to fully encapsulate what they've done to us. It drug us through court. We're financially a mess. But what it robbed from me personally, it shattered my self-worth. It shattered my self-esteem. I can't be around them, much less love them. Or maybe for somebody else, we would say that friend, that business partner that we trusted, that we put our faith in, they stabbed us in the back. They completely betrayed us. I don't know how to love them. I don't know what your story is, but we all have those stories. And it's a very challenging thing to read Jesus' words and begin to say, Jesus, I don't know how to do that. How do we even begin to do that? But that's the challenge that Jesus is laying in front of us. He goes, I don't want you to take revenge, nor do I want you to be passive when it comes to that particular relationship. I want you to find a third way that allows you to take a stand against. And here's the reason why Jesus is advocating a completely different way. If you go with route number 1, if you take that revenge, somebody has caused you great pain, and frankly, they probably deserve whatever you want to do to them. But I think what Jesus is saying is if we take the pathway of revenge, it doesn't free us from the wound. It doesn't free us from the pain. What revenge often does is it pours gasoline in the fire. It ends up magnifying the wound and the pain that we experience. The way of revenge is never the way of freedom. If we were to take a passive approach and just allow the person who's wounded us to continue to wound us over and over again, what would happen over the course of time, we may not outwardly explode toward them, but inwardly it just shreds our lives. It just shreds us apart. And the resentment can grow and grow and grow and grow. And the reality of it is there's no freedom in the second path either. And the reason that Jesus is advocating this third path, I believe, is less about the offender. It's less about the person who's done the offense. It's more often about the person who's been offended And truly being able to take a stand that you might be able to look that giant in the face and experience something different. That maybe it's through the third way that God enacts his power to slay the giant of resentment, that it no longer calls the shots. It's no longer the one that's dominating our lives, that we can truly experience a sense of freedom. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we look for that? How do we create an active and positive approach when it comes to living out love for even our extreme enemies? There may be a lot of aspects to it, but certainly one of the aspects to it that we can't get away from is what the Bible talks about over and over again, this idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is woven in every single page of Scripture. It's so near and dear to the heart of God. And so the question becomes, how do we begin to extend forgiveness in situations that somebody has caused us such great pain in our lives? Now, as we discover this journey, I want to be really clear about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness does not necessarily take the pain of the past away, and frankly, forgiveness doesn't change the past. Forgiveness is not saying that we can't acknowledge what happens. Actually, I would encourage you to acknowledge whatever it is. It doesn't avoid the reality of the truth. Here's another piece about forgiveness we need to understand, that there's a drastic difference between forgiveness and trust. That it's possible to forgive someone without trusting them again. And in some situations, the person shouldn't be trusted again. Forgiveness is something that can be given. Trust is something that has to be earned. We need to understand that forgiveness and trust are two radically different things. So exactly what is forgiveness? And how do we really begin to live that out in a mindful way? One of the best definitions I've ever heard of forgiveness came from Pastor Andy Stanley. He's the lead pastor of a church called North Point Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He says this. He says, forgiveness is learning how to cancel the debt. Forgiveness is canceling the debt. What in the world does that mean? Well, again, using the examples we used earlier, what we recognize is when somebody wounds us, when somebody offends us, what happens is there's a debt now in that relationship. And so if a parent left our family when we were a kid and a parent created a very, very difficult scenario for us growing up, the reality is they created a debt. There was stuff that they took from us. They took our childhood from us. They took stability from us. They took a bit of our self-worth from us. There's a debt that exists. There's something that they've taken from us that we haven't gotten back. There's a debt. An ex-spouse who was unfaithful, that drug us through court. There's a debt that exists there. In some ways, it can be even literally a financial debt that's associated with it. But no debt, there's a relational debt. There's a lack of stability. There's a shattered sense of worth. There's a debt that exists there. What forgiveness is acknowledging the debt. It's saying, I have every right to repay you for what you've done, and I choose not to. I cancel the debt. It's not that I'm passive and just allow you to take advantage of me. No, I'm going to take a stand, but I'm going to choose not to do what you probably deserve. Here's why that becomes so challenging for us, is because it feels so unfair that the person who was offended is the one that has to take care of the debt. That's not fair. Why isn't the person who did the wrong, why aren't they responsible for the debt? Can I be honest with you? They couldn't eradicate the debt if they tried. Because they can't give back to you what's been taken. Your parent can't give back your childhood that they took from you. Your ex-spouse can't give you back the self-worth that they took from you. They have a debt that they cannot repay. And so the only way the debt gets taken care of is if the person who was offended eradicates the debt that could not be paid in any other way. It's the only way. Well, how is that possible? Like, where in the world do we get the power and the courage to do something like that? I don't know about you. I don't have that kind of power. I can't just wake up one day and kind of muster up you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to figure out how to extend that. That's not in me. I've got to look outside of me to experience what it will take to be able to cancel the debt that somebody else really doesn't deserve. And where I find that power is in the words of Paul. A little bit later in the New Testament, when Paul's writing about forgiveness, here's what Paul says. He says, forgive each other just as in Christ God forgave you. The two most important words are these highlighted words. It's the hinge of all of it. If you want to really learn and know how to extend forgiveness, it's all tied in right here, because it's not just us figuring out on its own. It's based on what God has already done for us. We do just as God has already done. In other words, what he's saying is this, is that God is saying, don't just do unto others as they've done to us. Don't do unto others as they deserve. Instead, I want you to do unto others just as God in Christ has already done for you. What I begin to recognize, if I'm willing to recognize it, is the debt that exists between me and that other person was the exact same debt that once existed between me and God. The reality is in my life that there are things that I have done that have broken and created a disjointed relationship with God. And the reality of it is I was the one responsible for it, but it was a debt that I could not pay. There was a debt that I could not eradicate. And so God was the one who was offended by my sin. He filled the gap, and he eradicated the debt that I could not repay through his son Jesus. God did for me what I could never do. And so God says, I want you to take what I've done for you, and I want you to extend that to someone else. But understand that forgiveness doesn't start with us. Forgiveness actually starts with God. The best way I know how to say it is this. It is impossible to be a forgiving person until you fully embrace you're a forgiven person. It's impossible to be a forgiving person until you fully embrace that you're a forgiven person. And so you might say to the person who's wounded you and offended you, well, they don't deserve it. Neither did I. Well, they're not worthy of it. Well, neither am I. And it's impossible for me to be a forgiving person until I fully embrace I'm forgiven. But the moment I recognize fully what God has done for me, it gives me the power what I would never be able to do on my own. Can I push this a little bit? Here's what I've discovered in my own journey. That if I go through life feeling like everybody else has done far worse things that I have ever done, I'll never find the power to forgive. If I journey through life believing that I'm just the victim of all the things that everybody else has done, I'll never find the power to forgive. But in humility, if I'm able to recognize that I had a debt with God that I could not repay, but God did for me what I didn't deserve. And if I lean on his grace, his power, his love, he can give me what I need to face the giant. And ultimately has the power to take down the giant. It was years and years ago that my home was broken into when we lived in a different suburb in Chicagoland. And it was, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of somebody being in your home, but it's an incredibly violating experience. And we were actually at the home. We were upstairs sleeping when somebody else was in our home. We only discovered it the next morning when we came downstairs, and there were some things that were missing, lots in disarray, and then the door to the garage was propped open, the garage door was open. It was very obvious that somebody had been in our home. It messed with me in a very big way. Not just because they took some stuff. I wasn't really that concerned about the material stuff. All that can be replaced. I felt so violated, and as a dad of young kids at the time, I felt like whoever this person was had put my family at risk. And there was something in me It's hard to describe what I felt in the moment. And we did what you would have done in the moment. We called the police. They came over. They filled out a report. The police officer said, hey, just so you know, we probably will never find the people responsible. And I thought to myself, please lie to me. Just tell me you're going to do your best. Even if that's true, just tell me you're going to do your best, and I can at least live with the false sense of hope. I think I would enjoy that more. But what ends up happening is over the next probably 2 weeks, there were 7 more residential burglaries in our neighborhood. It was very clear that somebody was responsible for likely all of these burglaries. But the further they went, the less wise they became. And after the 7th burglary, they were apprehended. And so I had a name and a face associated with the person who was in my home. Now, early on, I probably let it go pretty quickly because, they were apprehended. They're not going to be in my home anymore. I probably hadn't really thought too much about it. And literally months and months went by when I had thought really very little. And I happened to be preparing a message actually on forgiveness. And I was praying through the message, and I was asking God, is there anybody in my life that I need to extend forgiveness to? And God brought this name and this face to my mind that I hadn't thought about in months. And so I kind of, prayed through it and thought through it, and I thought, okay, God, I forgive him, and then kind of was going to move on. And I felt like God really pressing into me and saying, no, it's not going to be that easy for you. I want you to go and see him, and I want you to let him know in person that he's forgiven. And it's not that I was resistant to the fact that God loves him and that God has grace for him. I just didn't really want to be the carrier of that message. So I started praying like, God, would you just send somebody else? I don't know. I'm fine that he receives that message. I just don't want to be the deliverer of the message. It's just a little too close to home for me. And I couldn't shake the idea that I sensed that that's what God was asking me to do. And maybe it's because I'm a pastor and I can get in to see him without being on his visitation list. I'm not really sure, but I couldn't shake it. I remember waking up one Wednesday morning. It's a snowy, cold Wednesday morning. And I remember making my way toward that particular jail cell that I knew he was being kept at. The entire way I fought God over it. Entire way I was asking God, there's a lot I got to do today. I was trying to think of every possible excuse to get myself out of it. Still asking that maybe God would throw a Hail Mary and send somebody else instead. I was anything. I found so much resistance in my heart that it's hard for me to articulate how much I didn't want to be there. I roll up to the jail parking lot. I sat in the parking lot for probably another 30 to 40 minutes wrestling with God over it, not wanting to walk in the door. And I think it's probably by God's grace that he gave me the courage to get out of my car, and I walked in. I identified myself to the police officer who was there at the jail, and I told him the prisoner that I wanted to see. He kind of had a funny look on his face, because obviously I was not on his visitation list, but as a pastor, he allowed me to visit this particular inmate. They bring out the record where you sign in to see the visitor, and I recognized that I was the very first name in about 6 months to visit this particular inmate. And so I went and they led me in. I sat down. I don't know if you've ever been to one of these situations, but I sat down. There's a glass and they bring him in. He's a 19-year-old kid and they set him right in front of me. I didn't really know what to say. I had rehearsed about 5 to 7 seconds of what I was going to say. After that, I had no idea what I was going to do. And so he sat down in front of me. He obviously had no idea who I was. And so I just said, hey, man, I know you don't know me, but I'm a pastor in the area. I know a little bit about your story, and I just wanted to be here today to tell you that God cares a lot about you, and I do too. That's all I had rehearsed to say. I'm like, God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do from this point forward. And he just simply looked back at me and he goes, thanks, man. No problem. What do we do now? So I just started asking him questions about his story, his life, and I found out he grew up in a very, very difficult home situation, had zero father figure. His mom was trying to do the best she could by working multiple jobs, but really for the most part, leaving he and his siblings to kind of figure it out themselves. Pretty rough few years for him. I began to recognize, and I was reminded of that moment when I signed in that the kid really has nobody. Nobody's coming to visit him. Nobody in the world really cares for him, at least from his perspective. And it didn't take long before I became really, really compassionate for his situation. And so I kind of was leaning in and doing my best to try to open my heart to him at some level. And I kind of sensed that God said, you need to tell him who you really are. I thought, no, good. God, this is going actually just fine just right now. I don't need to tell him that. And I felt like the Spirit was really pressing me. Go, no, you got to tell him who you really are. So I said, okay, I think I need to be really honest with you. I am a pastor, and I do want you to know that God cares for you. But I also know that you're here for some residential burglaries, and I need to be honest with you that I'm actually one of those homeowners. I mean, his demeanor immediately changed. His eyes got really big. And then he goes, corner house, Furlong Street? Like, bro, that just messed with me, but yes, that's where I lived. He was silent for quite a time, and tears began to well up in his eyes, and he said, I'm sorry. I said, I didn't come here for an apology. I really didn't. But it means a lot to me that you would extend one. I just want you to know that you're a young kid. You're 19 years old. You got your entire life in front of you. And I believe in a God of second chances. And what's defined your story in the past doesn't have to define you from this day forward. If you allow me to, I'd love to help walk you through a second chance. We got to talking a lot about second chances and second hopes and second opportunities. I kind of felt like God was messing with me again, going, Sean, don't just talk to him about second chances. You got to be a second chance. So I looked back at him and I said, listen, the first time you came into my house, you came in without an invitation. Don't do that again. But when you get out of this place, I want you to come back to my house, but this time by my invitation. I want you to come share dinner with my family. I want you to know that I truly care. And I want you to know that I truly forgive. And there in that jail cell, in the most unlikely way, God gave me the most unlikely friend. You know, as I've told the story, a few times since, there's sometimes people come up to me and say, Sean, it's really cool what you did for that kid. I don't see it that way. I'm really grateful to God for what that kid did for me. Because the truth is, I was facing a giant. It was a giant of resentment. It was only through this relationship that I began to understand the words that were first written by Lewis Smedes when he says, forgiveness is learning how to set the prisoner free, only to discover that prisoner was me. And sometimes forgiveness is not as much about the offender as it is about our own heart, experiencing freedom in our own journey. I don't know your story. And I don't know what's been done over the years. But likely at some point in your journey, you faced a giant of resentment. Revenge only makes the giant grow taller. Becoming passive only allows the giant to grow taller. But we're willing to choose a third way. Actively loving, actively forgiving, being people, though offended, who choose to cancel the debt. I've watched God slay some giants. I know that's not an easy journey, so what I like to do, I love to invite you to stand. And what I love to do is just say a prayer for you, just asking God to help us do what we can't do on our own. So, Father, I come before you on behalf of every single person who's a part of Mission Church, both those who are here and those who are joining us via Facebook Live. Father, I just ask that you would do what we cannot do on our own. God, we can't muster up just within inside of us what's necessary to cancel the debt, but God, would you help us first ground our lives in our own debt that you canceled? And God, would your power be so pervasive in our lives that you give us the courage to extend what we receive from you. God, help us be a forgiving person because we are a forgiven person. Thank you for your forgiveness that comes to us in Jesus. God, we just ask you to slay the giant of resentment in our lives. We love you. We say thanks. In Jesus' name, amen.